welcome all of you for this webinar that we've organized about the Iran nuclear deal, particularly in light of the election of Joe Biden as President of the United States. I'm Naeem Jinnah. I'm the Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Center. Many of the names I see here have attended previous events of ours, so I'm not going to spend time introducing AMEC, particularly because we're starting late. It's amazing how online meetings have made us as punctual as they have. Let me start with a little third world apology. Our fourth speaker, Zinat Adam, is unfortunately unable to join us. The area in which she lives has had an internet outage from this morning, and so she's not able to join us. In fact, there's a general problem with internet access across South Africa because of some fault with the undersea cables. So if our connection just dies, that would be the reason. Although the rest of us, apart from one or two localities, have been fine for most of the day. So that's Zinat's apology. But the other three speakers that we have are present today. So as I said, with Joe Biden having become President of the United States and taken over the White House, these days we talk about the United States and we use kind of military terminology like that. He has promised before even he became president on a number of issues that he would return to international treaties, that he would repair relations with various allies across the world, particularly Europe and other allies, and in general attempt to reverse a number of foreign policy decisions that were taken by Donald Trump in his 4 years as president. And in some ways return America's foreign policy to what it was at the end of the Obama era. Of course, not on every issue. There's a number of issues, for example, regarding Palestine and Israel, which are not going to be reversed, but we are not going to be discussing those today. One of the issues that has been, of course, something that has been discussed from during the election campaign is whether Biden will take the United States back into the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, as it is called. The Iranians have been, I'm sure, hoping that that would be the case. There are indications that that would be the case, but we will hear more about where things stand from the now three speakers that we have on our panel. So let me quickly introduce all the three speakers so that I don't interrupt too much in between their presentations. Each of them will speak for 15 minutes and thereafter we'll open the floor for discussion, questions, etc. Our first speaker will be the ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Iran to South Africa, Ambassador Mahdi Aghajafari. He assumed his post in August 2020, right in the middle of lockdown and the pandemic in South Africa. So Ambassador, welcome not only to the webinar, but also welcome to South Africa. These days, 6 months is not necessarily too long a period. You can spend a whole year and not see anyone. Our second speaker is Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington and a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. Her work focuses on ending wars and occupations by changing US policy to strengthen international law, human rights, and equality in the Middle East in particular. Phyllis, I should add, is also a member of the advisory board of the Afro-Middle East Center. And our third speaker is Dr. Ali Fathullah Najad. Ali is Iranian, based in Germany. Ali is, we're very happy to say, a non-resident senior research fellow of the Afro-Middle East Center and a former Iran expert of the Brookings Institution in Doha and a former Iran expert of the German Council on Foreign Relations. So these will be our three speakers, speaking from, in a sense, three different perspectives on the issue, and providing us different angles by which we might approach our understanding of the issue and how we might see the resumption or non-resumption, whatever the case might be, of the Iran nuclear deal. With that introduction, let me ask Ambassador Aghajafari to take the floor. Ambassador.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear brothers and sisters, panelists of today's program, ladies and gentlemen, a respectful moderator, Brother Naeem, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. Hope we shall have more in understanding the current situation between Iran and the USA. I am sure this program will help South African thinkers in their analysis of important world issues. 1 week ago, Iranian people celebrated the 42nd anniversary of the victory of the Islamic Revolution. Last year really was a very tough year for Iran due to illegal sanctions and the maximum pressure of the Trump administration, as well as the pandemic and the prevention of the United States even from providing the medical needs of the Iranian people. Let me first summarize the situation between two countries. Since the victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, Iran and the USA has been facing off against each other. On one side, a state naming itself the superpower of the world after the Second World War, with the desire to dominate the world, and on the other side, a revolutionary Islamic country with anti-imperialism and anti-arrogance motto. It can be said that the crisis and tensions of these last few years is in the continuation of these old confrontation between the two countries. Before the start of the nuclear talks that led to the JCPOA, it seems that the Obama administration somehow accepted and acknowledged to engage with Iran as an influential regional power. And the result was a nuclear deal. Continuing this realistic approach could help ease tensions in the region after years of misguided Washington policy. But with the election of Trump, things went backward once again. Of course, with the lobby of his advisors and some regional parties. So Trump turned to the failed policy once again. On 8 May 2018, the United States officially withdrew from JCPOA. The justification used by the then US president was that the deal is horrible. Even after that verdict, Iran remained loyal to the agreement or the deal as it was reported by the IAEA several times. The United States of America took it further by reimposing nuclear sanctions and imposing new sanctions against Iran. Even the International Court of Justice order to stop the sanctions didn't compel them to cease this illegal act. As the US Secretary of State mentioned, the toughest sanctions ever placed, unlawfully imposed on Iran. And now, who is suffering more? The answer is clear, it's Iranian. The civilians who are living their lives in their own country, having hope for a better future. Following the US pullout from the JCPOA, Iran waited a whole year for the other parties to the deal, namely E3 plus Russia and China, to do their obligations due to the JCPOA. But as they failed to do so, Iran began to scale down its commitments under the paragraphs 26 and 36 of the deal in May 2019. However, Tehran has repeatedly insisted that it will return to full compliance once the other parties honor their commitments. It clearly means the lifting of US sanctions.
Ambassador, apologies for interrupting you. Your sound suddenly went very soft.
It's okay?
Yeah, it's better now. Thank you.
Okay. However, repeatedly insisted will return to feel to something. I'm calling through my mobile. Someone is calling me, but unfortunately, maybe affect my voice. Tehran has repeatedly insisted that it will return to full compliance once the other parties honor their commitments. Clearly, the lifting of US sanctions, the way that Iran can practically benefit from the inter deal. Gentlemen, now with this background, all have, who must now come back to its commitments? The United States, which has illegally withdrawn from the agreement and has returned to its terms and obligations even after the change of administration, has no right to assign tasks to other members of the agreement. Up to now that we are running this program, Iran acted as a party committed to JCPOA, and all its actions were based on the rights, on its own rights it has in the deal. On the other side, an entity which is not a party of the deal anymore, expecting us to faithful to the deal. USA must bear in mind that they are not a part of JCPOA anymore. If they want us to do anything, they must first come back to the deal and implement their obligations. As Minister Zarif mentioned earlier, we feel that the Americans have not yet decided on their policies. That's why the White House had to correct Mr. Biden's remarks many times recently. Biden administration officials keep talking about Iran's compliance with JCPOA. In what capacity they are talking? The US ceased participation in JCPOA in May 2018, and violated it, also punished those complying with UN resolution. Also, Iran's leader Ayatollah Khamenei reiterated that Iran will return to its JCPOA obligations once the US fully lifts its sanctions in action and not in words or on paper. And once the sanctions relief is verified by Iran. As an official stand of Iran, Minister Zarif also mentioned that whenever all of Iran's blocked assets in the world, including money for food and medicine for Iranian people, are unblocked, the country would see that as a goodwill gesture from the US side. If the US shows such goodwill, the response to it will definitely be goodwill as well. If someone says, while the US should take action to remove sanctions, it should also be reassured that Iran would return to compliance with the JCPOA. The answer is clear. Also, for that to take place, we have a mechanism in the JCPOA called the Joint Commission. Let me conclude my speech by these words, that this year, on the 42nd anniversary of the victory of the Islamic Revolution of Iran, the free nations of the world are witnessing the defeat of the maximum pressure and economic terrorism of the Trump administration against the Iranian nation. World public opinion awaits the return of the new US administration to its commitments under the JCPOA and lifting the unilateral, oppressive, and illegal US sanctions against Iran. Continuation of the current situation means the continuation of the failed policy of the Trump administration by the Joe Biden administration, and will be doomed to failure. Furthermore, it is true that the Trump administration economic terrorism against Iran has failed, but the extent of the huge damages inflicted on the country and the Iranian people over the past 4 years must also be clarified. The US government and US administration is not only obliged to immediately lift the sanctions imposed by Trump on Iran, but is also responsible for compensating the huge damages inflicted on the Iranian people and the Iranian economy as a result of these illegal sanctions. The Islamic Republic of Iran has the right to claim and pursue damages through legal as well as political and diplomatic channels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that presentation, and very unusually for a diplomat actually speaking less than the time allocated to you. Thank you for that. But I think you've put across all the points that you needed to make, it seems to me. Phyllis, let's get over to you. I mean, clearly you cannot, nor will you want to, talk on behalf of the US administration or the US government or their position on it. But being in Washington, I'm guessing that you will be referring to how the matter is viewed from that perspective. So over to you, Phyllis.
Thank you very much, Naeem. And thank you, Ambassador, for that very clear presentation. I also want to thank the staff of AMEC for their good work in organizing this event this morning, or this afternoon. You know, US policy towards Iran has always been rooted in the combination of the long-term global and regional military and economic interests of US imperialism. In a sense, during the Trump period, those interests were there was less accountability, I would say, to the traditional interests of US imperialism, and it was a much more personalized set of drivers that were creating the policy. But those interests, military and economic interests in the region and globally, still shape how policy is being considered in the US. The other thing that has to come into account, though, is the political moment that we are in right now. After the elections, the highly contested election, the attempted insurrection that you're all familiar with of last month, the presence of a new president and a new administration, this political moment is one in which there's not only a new president, but there's a lot of changes underway politically. Within the Democratic Party, there is a rising, stronger progressive wing that now has far more influence than in the past, both in terms of people being elected to Congress that represent and are accountable to that progressive wing, and in the street level, the movements, the movement we saw last summer, the movement for Black Lives, the movement against police repression, all of those changes have quite dramatically transformed the political landscape. In Congress, there are fewer Democrats this time around, but there are more progressives among them, more willing to challenge imperialist assumptions in certain areas. There were more people of color and more progressives that were themselves elected, and people of color and progressives were responsible for electing President Biden. That's very important. There's a recognition in the White House that there has to be some accountability to those forces. Black women, more than anyone else, put Joe Biden in the White House. And there's a recognition that there has to be some kind of recognition of that. We're seeing it somewhat on some of the positions that the new administration is taking on several issues, most importantly on climate, somewhat on immigration, economic and health issues, and a little bit even issues around racial justice and labor rights. Where we see the biggest gap between that progressive wing and the traditional centrist and right centrist wing that's led by Biden himself, the biggest gap is on foreign policy. And there's a host of reasons for that, which we don't have to get into, but it is a reality that in the question of foreign policy, the progressive forces simply don't have the same level of influence, either in Congress or in the streets, as our colleagues and comrades in some of the other social movements that have been so extraordinary in this last year. On the other hand, we are seeing in, for example, the early days, the executive orders that President Biden issued in the first couple of days when he took office have been surprisingly positive, better than many of us anticipated. Many of them are aimed at reversing positions Trump had taken. Some are going further than that. So we had the ending of the Muslim ban, some major reversals of Trump policy on immigration, the cancellation of the XL pipeline and ending the possibility of drilling for fossil fuels in the Arctic, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, rejoining the WHO, re-engaging with the United Nations, extending the New START Treaty, a commitment to investigating the rise of white supremacy within the US military around the world, and crucially for our discussion today, putting at least a temporary pause on major arms deals to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. $500 million in precision-guided missiles that were supposed to go to Saudi Arabia, and $23 billion worth of F-35 fighter bombers that had been ordered by the UAE. During the Trump years, as we've just heard from the ambassador so eloquently, policy towards the Middle East was all about Iran and Israel. It was the interests of Israel as part of as the central part of a new coalition against Iran. That was very much the core of US policy in the region. And that included things like, from the Pentagon's vantage point, the Pentagon drafts maps of which of their commands will be in charge of what parts of the world. Suddenly, Israel is now considered part of Central Command's jurisdiction rather than the European Command. Why? Because suddenly Israel was making nice with its Arab neighbors in the interest of building an anti-Iran coalition. So there's a number of these changes that were made by Trump. As we know, on the Israel question, we won't go into the details, but we know that those really extremist placating of the furthest right-wing extremists within Israel and their supporters in the United States have not yet been reversed and will not probably be reversed for quite some time. On the question of the war in Yemen, however, there has already been an indication of shifts from the Biden administration, taking the Houthi forces off of the so-called foreign terrorist organization list, where at the very last minute in his administration, Trump had put them, which would have had absolutely devastating humanitarian consequences in Yemen. And crucially, the question becomes, where will the Biden administration come down on the issue of sanctions? I have little doubt that President Biden and his advisors, at least most of his advisors, want to return to the JCPOA. It's part of the Obama legacy. It's widely viewed as Obama's major diplomatic achievement. And there's no doubt that Biden wants to claim that as his own. He wants to get credit for not only being part of it as vice president under Obama, but also as president in his own right. The question will be, how much political capital is he willing to spend to make that happen? And how does he understand what's going to be needed? It's very important what we heard earlier from the ambassador about the impact of sanctions on Iran and the recognition of US culpability. We've seen this for decades now in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere, where the US imposition of sanctions and then going to war devastated whole populations. We all remember in 1996 when Madeleine Albright, then the Secretary of State, said that she thinks the price was worth it for the death of 500,000 Iraqi children who died of US sanctions. It was an unspeakable claim of something like that. But it is the legacy of US wars in the region. The impact of sanctions is so rarely understood and so rarely recognized by high-ranking US officials. It's always described in the context of sanctions against the government, sanctions that are designed to bring the government to do X or to bring down the government. Sometimes they acknowledge that, rarely. But in all cases, the impact, as the ambassador said, is felt by people in Iran, by children. The impact of sanctions that has caused malnutrition among children, something unprecedented in modern Iranian history, has to be taken seriously by the United States. So when we look at sort of where is the Biden administration on this, there's both good news and bad news. The bad news we heard in the confirmation hearings in Congress of the top 3 foreign policy officials of the Biden administrations all said the same thing. They all said, we want to return to the JCPOA when Iran is back in compliance, and we are a long way from that, taking no responsibility for the fact that it was the United States that pulled out of the agreement in the first place, and that it was that US abandonment that led to these shifts. And they don't recognize the impact of US sanctions on the people of Iran. On the other hand, there has been some good news as well. It's less clear exactly how much accountability there will be from the Biden administration to the military-industrial complex, the corporations that produce these military weapons. The pausing of the sales to the UAE and Saudi Arabia is an indication of that. The appointment of Wendy Sherman now as the Deputy Secretary of State is a good indication, because she, of course, is very much identified publicly with the JCPOA. She knows far better than most diplomats in the US what the impact of sanctions has actually meant. She has good ties with not only Foreign Minister Zarif, but with other Iranian diplomats as well. And most especially the appointment last week of Rob Malley as the new envoy to Iran in terms of getting back into the JCPOA. I'm not sure how many of you have seen it. There was a very important article just published by Rob Malley a few days ago in Foreign Affairs, clearly written before he was appointed to this new position was an article about US complicity for the disaster of the Yemen war. And in that article, he says something very important. He says, and I quote here, "Ending the Yemen war may prove to be beyond the new administration's influence. Ending US complicity in that war is not." I think that's a very important recognition for the man who has just been appointed the new envoy. So that's a good sign. Just yesterday, Secretary of State Blinken said on National Public Radio that the JCPOA is very effective and that both US and international intelligence agencies had all agreed that it was working. That's a good sign. It's, again, there were these bad signs. So we don't know exactly where things stand, but there are these tensions between various positions within the administration. Those who want to continue the anti-Iran mobilization that took new heights under Trump, but had a long history even before that, and those who want to go back to diplomacy, not war, as the basis of US relationships with Iran. Under Joe Biden, Iran is still central, and not in necessarily a good way, to his understanding of what changes need to happen in the Middle East. There are, again, some good signs pulling back from the Saudi alliance, perhaps. We don't know what that means in terms of a bigger role for Israel within that Israel and Gulf monarchies alliance that Trump had pulled together so dramatically. We hear again that Biden wants to end the war in Yemen. We don't know exactly what that means. Does it mean only ending the ground war, or is there actually a commitment somewhere to ending the what the US calls counterterrorism operations, the airstrikes and drone strikes that are in fact responsible for most of the civilian deaths of Yemeni civilians in these days. So all of these indicate that there is room for maneuvering. What we face, and I want to finish quickly so we have time for questions and discussion. Certainly Israel and its supporters play a major role in determining what the Biden administration will do in the Middle East in general and in Iran in specific, but it also indicates that there is room for pressure in a new way, in a way that was certainly not the case during the during the Trump years, and was difficult even during the Obama years until the initiative for the JCPOA emerged. Much of this will depend on our movements more than the government. How much are our movements in the United States prepared to wage major campaigns of pressure to force an approach that is based on diplomacy and not war in dealing with Iran, on going back to the JCPOA. Congress voted last year to cut all US involvement in the Yemen war. That was vetoed by Donald Trump. That will likely come up again. I think that President Biden is likely not to veto it, but to sign that into law. The Progressive Caucus of the Congress, in their proposal, they call for ending all of the US military role in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, including ending all arms sales for 5 years, a complete legal ban on mid-air refueling, ending intelligence sharing, ending the targeting assistance that the US was providing to Saudi Arabia. This is a very important shift, because that is now a far more influential component in Congress than has been the case earlier. But at the end of the day, what's true here, as is so often the case in the United States, what the Biden administration does towards Iran and towards the world is going to be determined as much by what people in the United States, our social movements, can do to provide major campaigns of pressure on members of Congress, on the White House itself, on the State Department, on the administration as a whole, forcing a return to the United Nations as the venue for diplomacy rather than the United States going it alone with its traditional unilateralism. The challenge to American exceptionalism is the challenge that our movements in my country face today. And it's going to be the question of how we succeed or fail that's going to determine very much what US policy towards Iran looks like in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis, for the bad news and the good news. I think the 2 presentations thus far shows that we have a lot to engage with and a lot to interrogate on this issue. Our third speaker is Dr. Ali Fatullah Nejad. Ali, kind of insider outsider in a sense on Iran, Iranian but not based in Iran. We heard from the ambassador about how the Iranian government and as well as the supreme leader views this whole issue. Perhaps we can hear from you slightly differently about Iran, Ali, and that is how Iranians view the issue and also the kind of tensions within the political elite on the question of the JCPOA and compliance and return to the JCPOA by the US. Ali.
Thank you so much, Naeem. So I'm going to start with describing the official Iranian strategy. That is basically a déjà vu of the Iranian strategy pursued in the 2000s, prior to the JCPOA and prior to the Oman Channel breakthrough. And secondly, I'm going to take some issues with what the other panelists have said, especially with Phyllis, from a progressive standpoint. So let me start by explaining what is going, in my view, realistically, what is going on without so much resorting to ethical or international legal considerations, which unfortunately are not, the most important aspects, not only in this conflict, but also in other world conflicts, and also not the most important dynamics. So as I briefly said, what we're witnessing today is a déjà vu. Because if you can recall the 2000s, the Iranian nuclear, so-called Iranian nuclear conflict that had started in 2002, we had seen over that decade a parallel escalation of sanctions on one hand and Iran's nuclear program on the other. So that by the end of that decade, we had on the sanctions side reached a crippling point with then President Obama admitting that in 2009 because of a combination of sanctions on Iran concerning this, concerning the central bank and Iran's oil exports, and also the EU joining the oil embargo on Iran. And this was, in fact, as I explained in my upcoming book, Iran in an Emerging New World Order, this was, in fact, a breaking point, analytically speaking, because it changed the cost-benefit calculation in Tehran. Why so? Because sanctions had become crippling. It is true that for Iran, they can resist sanctions, and they do so, even if they're strong. But once they become extreme, the cost-benefit analysis tends to change, because after all, it will undermine the crucial incomes of the establishment. And so this cost-benefit had changed, which enabled the breakthrough in the secret so-called Oman Channel between Iran and the United States. From the US side, a lot of the people that also Phyllis mentioned that are part of the current Biden administration. Of course, the Obama administration also changed its position back then, if you can remember that. It dropped its zero enrichment demand. But more importantly than that, the Iranian side was moving, because Iran, after all, during the ensuing JCPOA negotiations in 2013, that were, more or less in the public realm, not in, not secretly, Iran had agreed to basically stop its nuclear program, and it had granted tremendous concessions on the nuclear program, so that so basically, in retrospect, sanctions played an important role in changing Iranian cost-benefit calculations back then. Today, we're seeing that, and then of course there was the JCPOA, and which was signed in 2015. It was implemented in 2016, January 2016, and after which there was a revitalization of trade with the outside world. And we know that about 80% of that trade went to semi-state and state entities, which is basically the very definition of the regime. And so there was a lot of frustration among many Iranians. I'm going to inject a bit of the societal aspect here before continuing with the strategic aspects of foreign policy. And so we know that there was the Rouhani administration was campaigning on the promise to improve Iranians' socioeconomic and political situation, especially via the JCPOA and its economic dividends. However, in reality, those dividends overwhelmingly went to, as I said, semi-state and state entities, so that already during the during 2016, we had seen the emergence of a lot of social frustration among large segments of the Iranian population, with, as we know from economic analysis, income inequality had risen. And this all paved the way for the emergence of unprecedented nationwide anti-regime uprisings, first at the turn of the year 2017-18, and then continuing more forcefully in November 2019, led by the lower classes. That was hitherto considered to be the social basis of the regime, or at least loyal to it. And preceding the 2017-18, or at the turn of the year 2017-18 protests, there were in the preceding 1.5 years, we had over 1,600 social protests from a number of groups that American progressives should be very much sympathizing with. So now going back to, so the JCPOA was signed, and Iran had fulfilled its obligations, as we know from several IAEA reports, as the ambassador rightfully underlined. And it was, more the US side that didn't really stick to its side of the deal, although there was some revitalization of the trade because, not all sanctions against Iran were lifted. So that with Trump coming to power, he unilaterally withdrew with the United States from the JCPOA, thus violating it, basically, by May 2018, to which the Iranian side reacted by its own strategy that was coined the maximum resistance strategy. This maximum resistance strategy was a mirror image of the aforementioned Iranian nuclear strategy. So at its core, the Iranians committed or announced that, which also the ambassador referred to a gradual reduction of their nuclear commitments under the JCPOA. The last two steps of which were the late last year, revival of 20% enrichment by the Iranians, and now the recent announcement by the Iranians that was also communicated to the IAEA to stop unannounced sanctions, unannounced inspections by the IAEA. So all of that is geared towards the same aim as then, that is to increase the bargaining leverage of the Iranian side in eventual negotiations with the United States. And all of this, despite some talk to the contrary, is an elite consensus within the Islamic Republic. This strategy was an elite consensus, and there is a body that is called the Supreme National Security Council in Iran, which comprises all factions of the Iranian establishment. So the Iranians want to reconstitute the position that they had prior to the JCPOA talks. That is, to present the international community, to offer to the international community the poor choice between accepting a nuclear-armed Iran and bombing Iran. The latter option is even less prominent or less popular than it was during the Bush and Obama years. So as to be able to negotiate with the United States, not from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength. And all of that, as also the title of the parliamentary bill that was introduced in the Iranian conservative dominated parliament late last year, is towards getting rid of the sanctions, because the sanctions under the Trump administration had been, in fact, very crippling, despite the multilateral support. But they were very crippling. They decimated Iranian oil income, as we all know. And for the Islamic Republic, for the establishment, this is especially onerous because, one, in contrast to a decade ago, the oil price is much lower. Two, the public pressure from below against the establishment is much higher, as we've seen in the, in those protest waves that were unprecedented, that were revolutionary in their demands. So that there is an urgency from the Iranian side to get rid of sanctions as soon as possible. So the Iranian side wants to present the international community this poor choice in order to start negotiation with the Biden administration as soon as possible to get rid of those sanctions. Now, the Biden administration during the campaign had pledged to fully return to the JCPOA, but it seems that it didn't, so far it didn't go that route. And I think this is because it has realized some of the problems and fallouts that were, or lessons from the Obama era. Of course, in non-proliferation, in the non-proliferation realm, the JCPOA has been successful. And I myself, during that decade, I was always advocating for a diplomatic settlement of the Iran nuclear conflict. But realistically speaking, what happened afterwards was that Iran was able to enforce its expansive regional policies in the region, especially in Iraq and in Syria, and was using, the economic dividends for its regional presence, but also for boosting its ballistic missile program. And realistically speaking, we have to understand that going back to the Obama era JCPOA would only entrench regional tensions, and it would, calm non-proliferation concerns for sure, but we would just see a replication of that situation back then, which in my view is not a sustainable situation, which also is not a sustainable solution to the Middle East, the problems in the Middle East in general. So going back to the Obama era JCPOA would only push, unfortunately, the anti-Iran front to perhaps take things on their own hands, and which would not to lead to the kind of détente that a lot of people around the world would hope for. Hence, extending, the scope of the deal beyond the nuclear issue would make sense, to talk about Iran's regional policies, but also perhaps, the range of its ballistic missile programs. Regarding the latter, there have been Iranian officials, also from the RGC, who were suggesting that some limitations would be feasible, but not doing so in a myopic way. Iran is not the only problem in the Middle East. There are several problematic actors, most notably, Saudi Arabia, but also Israeli policies and so forth. So we have to understand that all of that is somehow interrelated, and we should think about, extending the scope of negotiations. And for this to happen, realistically speaking, one would forfeit the chance to enlarge a debate with Iran on those issues if one were to return to the JCPOA Obama era, because by that one would, give away the leverage one has, that is sanctions, and the Iranian side, despite some rhetoric to the contrary, would of course not be willing to talk about those issues. So a more fruitful approach would be a transatlantic policy that not only addresses the malign aspects of Iranian policies in the region, but also that of Saudi Arabia as well, for instance, right? So let me now, by closing, Naeem, how many minutes do I still left?
You have 2 minutes, Ali.
Okay, 2 minutes, okay. Let me just say that from a progressive viewpoint, Phyllis, I think it is important to underline what you have said about the Biden administration's efforts to, end the U.S. support for the humanitarian catastrophe that is happening in Yemen, and to have a more critical view vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. But if you have this kind of humanitarian and progressive view, you should also say a few things about the Islamic Republic. And as you know, a lot of progressives in the region, especially those from Iraq and Syria, have not welcomed the kind of Obama policies. They have regarded the fallout, the geopolitical, ramifications from the JCPOA as basically handing, the region onto a silver plate to the Iranians, that they could expand the policies. And if you look at what Iranian regional policies are doing in Iraq and Syria, you would surely find a lot of problems with a progressive standpoint. So I think we should have a critical reading of the Obama doctrine. The Obama doctrine was rightly fueled by concerns over a myopic and overly militaristic approach of the Bush administration in the region, and the strategic blunder of the Iraq War. Hence, it was preferring some kind of authoritarian stability, as most markedly seen in the case of Syria with the Bashar al-Assad regime. But we cannot argue that the non-intervention that was, part of that Obama doctrine is per se a progressive solution. A progressive solution would be to embrace human rights as a central pillar for US policy in the region, regardless of the regimes, whether they're pro-US or anti-US. So this would be something that would also be in line with a lot of people who are protesting in Iran, who would see their own, government's misconduct as the prime reason, and not US sanctions or, US policy. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ali, for, as usual, complicating things more than they already have been. Nevertheless, thank you for that. And I see that Phyllis is also thanking you vigorously for the challenge that you've posed to her. So let me say what we're going to do now is in a few minutes, I will open the floor to participants, but I want to do it a bit differently. I don't want people to post their questions in the chat. I will allow people to actually ask their questions in their own voices. But before that, if we can just have one quick round between our three speakers. First, let's start with Phyllis. Phyllis, as I said, Ali has really kind of issued a challenge in terms of what you said. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I'll respond just very quickly, which is that I have numerous criticisms of policies of the Iranian government. I have numerous criticisms of pretty much every government in the world. I also believe that the progressive movement in the United States has a very particular responsibility to the global anti-imperialist and internationalist movement because of the role that our government, the government that my vote has a part in, that my taxes go to pay for, has a very particular role, as you all know, as the dominant danger to the world in particularly military ways, but economic ways as well, and in so many other ways. I think that our best support for internationalism and our best support for people fighting for human rights, which is in fact the fundamental component of how I view the world, is through the prism of human rights. And I believe that the best way to do that is to focus on the terrible things that my government is doing that prevent people in other countries from fighting their own struggles, whether it's a human rights struggle, whether it's a liberation movement, whether it's a struggle against apartheid for Palestinians, whether it's a struggle against colonialism in Western Sahara, whatever it might be, struggles that I support. I think we can best show real solidarity with those struggles by targeting our own government for the kind of changes that will be necessary to make that possible. I don't think that the best mobilizing of the movements in plural in the United States is best served, that internationalism is best served that anti-imperialism is best served by us targeting the challenges that we write about, we talk about, but that's not our job to change other governments as long as our government remains, in my view, the primary problem that's preventing other movements around the world that I identify with from successfully challenging their own governments.
Thank you, Phyllis. So for people who want to ask questions or make comments, either put your hands up or just put your name in the chat saying that you want to do so, and I will get to you. Ambassador, you spoke. Sorry, can you wait until I recognize you before you speak? Thank you. Ambassador, you spoke, as Phyllis said, very eloquently about the Iranian government position on this, and about the fact that the situation as it is now is that one party to the JCPOA pulled out, and by pulling out was non-compliant, as Ali said. Iran reciprocated to that, and the fact that it believed that the other parties were not upholding the agreement as they should have, Iran reciprocated by also becoming non-compliant in certain ways, in reversible ways, clearly, as has been said, but by becoming non-compliant. The issue now, and I want to, as much as I hate the way that Ali said this, I'm going to use it, and that is that the issue that we are faced with is where we have to deal with a real situation, not dealing necessarily with the ethics or the international law on it, but the practical situation. And the practical situation is one where Iranians are starving because of sanctions, dying because they're not able to get medication, whether it's for the COVID-19 pandemic or for other reasons, and a solution needs to be found. Also, some might argue that a solution needs to be found before your elections later this year, because otherwise things might be quite different. Is the Rouhani administration willing to say that, yes, ethically speaking, it was the Americans who became non-compliant first, but in order to ensure the ease of the lives of our people, we'll blink first, and we are willing to reverse our non-compliance in order to get the Americans back in?
Thank you, Mr. Naeem. I think today the fundamental question is whether Biden wants to return to Obama's policy of the last years, or to continue Trump failed policy. They have some beautiful words. The beautiful words are good, but not enough and do not solve the problem. And conversely, inaction of Biden administration will complicate the problem. As for the Biden government's policy on the, they talked about the Yemen or other issues. We should wait. We should wait and see practically what they will do. About Iran, I think America's position that Iran should first return to their commitments is completely irrational. Iran has consistently exercised restraint over the past 4 years. It is real, the reality that the other parties to the deal didn't take any action to compensate for the US withdrawal. We were constantly told to wait. In every negotiation, in every meeting, they asked us to wait. Wait, don't do something. And they could, the other parties, they could do anything. They could even activate index mechanism. So during these years, it was only Iran that kept this deal alone. Iran just kept this deal alone. We waited. Well, Trump left. Biden came. Those who were in the nuclear talks now back on the scene. Now they are in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, everywhere in administration. The people who were in JCPOA talks. Now it is the turn of Europe and America. What else should we do? We have kept the dying body of the JCPOA in the ICU with a ventilator. This situation cannot continue. The body cannot continue with ventilator. How many days? How many years? How many months? So we think that this question is not correct because they withdraw from JCPOA and they should return. We, as Mr. Fatullah Najat said, against the maximum pressure, we did the maximum resistance. And we will continue. If they don't want to return, okay, no problem. We go our way and they go their ways.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ali, a question for you before I open it up to the audience. You seem to be calling, Ali, for an extension of the regulations, and particularly talking about Iran's role in the region, etc. I'm not clear. Are you suggesting that any discussion around the US re-entry into the JCPOA needs to include these discussions, or are you suggesting that these need to be separate discussions? If the former, doesn't that open up a kind of approach to international law that just says that people can willy-nilly do as they like and expand and contract agreements and understandings based on their contextual needs or desires?
Very good question, Naeem, and I understand the concern. Yet what I'm saying is, I would argue from a realistic point of view. Because just imagine that we're going to see a return, full return of the Biden administration to the JCPOA, which would involve a full removal of nuclear related sanctions that were reimposed by Trump. And at the same time, Iran is going to fully recommit to its nuclear, obligations under the JCPOA. So this is what I call the Obama-era JCPOA. What would be the regional ramifications? The regional ramifications would be the same, probably, as after the Obama deal, which would then, force, realistically speaking, the so-called anti-Iran front, Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE, to take, because their worries, their concerns would be, again, sidelined in terms of Iran's regional presence, its ballistic missile program. And we're going to see not a détente in the region, but we're going to see regional tensions entrenched. And this is my worry. Because if you look at the preamble of the JCPOA, where the spirit was enshrined, you see that the expectation, especially from the Western states, was that the JCPOA gonna contribute strongly to a détente in the region. Whereas in reality, as we've seen, Iran has emboldened its presence in the region. Its policies in Iraq and Syria, which are highly problematic, have been boosted. And so maybe we're going to see the same thing, because the Iranian side would not be willing, if we have the replication of the Obama-era deal with all sanctions removed, they would have no real incentive to agree to talk about any issues beyond the nuclear deal. And in my view, those two issues, regional presence and ballistic missiles, would maybe have to be part of the basket, not because I myself would consider it important, but they are, it is connected to regional politics, to regional geopolitics. But in my view, human rights should also be on the agenda. So there should be, and I'm not expecting the Islamic Republic to change its policies overnight, both regionally and domestically. But I think through some leverage, there are some maneuvering room for the Iranians to engage in some course corrections on those fronts. Having said that, this policy on Iran has to be accompanied by a similar policy of pressure upon Saudi Arabia and upon other problematic actors in the region. Because if you do not take the geopolitics of the region as a holistic concept and only have a myopic way, either the Iran obsession of Pompeo or the mistakes of the Obama doctrine, and there we just have to talk to progressive peoples in Iraq and Syria, and they will let you know what they think about the JCPOA and what they fear about the return of an Obama 2.0 policy with Biden, that is a quasi-appeasement policy, for instance. I mean, we're talking about the JCPOA vis-a-vis Iran. So I think, all of that has to be understood in a holistic way.
Thank you, Ali. That's the Fatullah Nejad's version of the grand bargain. Phyllis, you want to make a quick point, and then we're going to ask Lissema, who had his hand up, for his question or comment. Phyllis?
Just very quick, and it goes directly to this point of being a grand bargain. I think that the notion of a grand bargain, which was very much on the table, if we look at the period between about 2001 and 2003, was very much on the table between the United States and Iran in ways that would have to not only deal with what you, Ali, have referred to as Iran's problematic activities in the region, which I absolutely agree with, particularly in Syria. I also agree with the US terrible positions in the region, including in Syria. The militarization on both sides was massively destructive, and we have in the US criticized all sides for the militarization of that struggle. The other side of it, though, is this notion that we need to acknowledge that the breadth of issues that need to be dealt with, putting them in the hands of the US to determine what they are willing to negotiate or whatever at any given moment, is rooted, it sounds like, from your position that sanctions work. And what we've seen around the world is that sanctions don't work to get countries to change their positions. They force people to starve. They deny people medical care. They don't have the impact that they're supposed to. And I know that there is an argument that says that Iran would not have pulled back. Iran maybe would have under other circumstances, maybe would not have. But we also know that there is a widespread understanding that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, isn't building a nuclear weapon. They pulled back from a nuclear power program that would have enabled a nuclear weapon at some point in the future, as is true in every country, but doesn't take into account the real cause of military escalation, nuclear escalation across the region, which is the existence of Israel's nuclear arsenal, that the government in the United States, for instance, is not even willing to acknowledge exists. So it's a very problematic, how broad do you go if you're going to say that we need not just this version of the JCPOA, but a broader version of the JCPOA and something that's going to take into account human rights in every country in the US, every country in the Middle East, because there's a lot of human rights problems in pretty much every country in that region. Is it going to have to take, and who gets to decide that? Who gets to negotiate that? Civil society isn't at the table for those negotiations. I don't want my government, the Obama government or the Trump government or the Biden administration, being in a position to determine what human rights should be in countries around the world. We know what their decisions are likely to be. If there's a human rights problem, it requires military intervention. So I just think we have to be really, really realistic. As you said, you were trying to be realistic. I think the first step is to go back to the JCPOA and then see whether some version of a grand bargain that would include Washington's problematic actions in the region, as well as Iran's problematic actions in the region, could be on the table.
Thank you, Phyllis. Ali is itching to respond, but Ali, in order not to make this a four-person conversation, you can respond a bit later. Let's get one or two of the participants who want to speak. Lissema, you had your hand up. You want to make a comment?
Yes. How are you?
Good, thanks. Do you want to put your camera on, Lissema? Okay, go ahead.
My question is to Comrade Phyllis, more especially with regard to having to mobilize civil society policies concerned. Particularly would be, how strong is this civil society movement that understands, that is inculcated, that says we need to change the focus of our foreign policy as Americans? And at the same time, the method of mobilizing the people, like for instance, today it is happening in Myanmar, where people are beating the pants, they're in the streets, but given the COVID-19 lockdowns, is it possible that they can be able to do the same in protests against American foreign policy, particularly towards Iran? Thank you.
Lissema. Phyllis?
It's a very good question, Lissema. I would say that civil society in the United States is not well enough mobilized on this issue. Efforts are going forward. There's amazingly creative protests underway that do not require large numbers of people in the streets because of COVID. But it's also true that people in the streets is not the only method of protest in the US or elsewhere. I think that what we are grappling with in the United States right now is a reality that in this new period that I spoke of earlier, foreign policy in general is not the main priority either of the administration or of most social movements. It's integrated into the issues, but right now the challenges facing people in the United States, we have 140 million people, more than half of them children, who are living either in poverty or one accident away from falling into complete poverty. It's not as widely known around the world, and poverty doesn't look the same as it does in other parts of the world. But we are talking about serious lack of food, lack of medical care, because of course we don't have a healthcare program in the United States. And in the context of the pandemic and the economic collapse that has been resulting from the pandemic everywhere, people in the United States are desperate, and governments, local, state, and federal governments are focused very strongly on keeping their work on the domestic side. In some ways, this is, in my view, better for many people around the world because US interventions so often make things worse. Whether or not they are launched in the name of making things better, the tendency is that they make things worse. But it's also very difficult to mobilize around foreign policy issues when so many people are focused on their being unemployed, on not having access to clean water, not having access to sufficient food, medical care, education, etc. So it's a challenge. I don't want to exaggerate what our capacity is, but I would say that we are working very hard to make sure that the work, for example, in the anti-racism mobilizations that we saw so brilliantly over the summer, despite the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests that were going on all through last summer, incorporated an anti-militarism component to that work that targeted not only militarism abroad, and including the need to end sanctions, but also the militarization of policies at home. When you have, for example, the Pentagon providing local police forces with weapons left over from the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. So when you had, for example, in 2014, the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, you had the killing by police of a young man in the small town of Ferguson that many of you may have heard about, Michael Brown. When he was killed, suddenly there was an armored personnel carrier on the streets of this small town in Missouri. Why was that? It was because of war in Afghanistan, and the Pentagon will provide leftover weapons, leftover armored personnel carriers to any police station that wants them in the country. And that militarizes our society. So the goal in terms of civil society mobilization is very much focused on making the question of foreign policy and ending US wars, ending US militarism, part of the work of fighting for racial justice, fighting for economic justice, etc. But it's a very hard slog.
Thank you, Phyllis. Ibrahim Dean, you had your hand up.
Okay. Am I audible?
You're audible, yes.
Okay, do I have to on my video or can I just leave it off?
Okay, leave it off if it's going to affect you.
Yeah, I'm not dressed up. Yeah. My question is to Dr. Najad. We're looking at this, the deal, and I mean, the fact that, I mean, in a sense, both parties really do want the deal. But how does this currently, or the current actions play into the, the impending presidential election in Iran? Will Rouhani, for example, return to full compliance actually, impede the chances for reformists in the presidential election? So how does this deal and how will a return, I mean, if there is a deal in the next couple of months, in a sense where, the US returns and sanctions relief, does this benefit the reformists or, or is it too, is the distrust too much? What will a possible principalist candidate victory in the election mean for the deal, even if it, comes into fruition, or at least there's a return to the deal in the next couple of months? So it's basically 5 questions, just basically talking about how the deal is viewed internally within the different political strands within the country.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I think we should have a rule that people who are not dressed are not allowed to be on online meetings. Certainly shouldn't be allowed to ask 5 questions. Ali.
Naeem, you don't even know if I am dressed. Okay, but
the top half looks dressed.
Exactly, it just looks dressed. Yeah, the portion of the video that you see. So Ibrahim, first of all, it's very good to hear your voice. Sure. I mean, in the Islamic Republic, we had traditionally over the last 2 decades or so, 2 main factions of the elite. One, the reformists, and the other, the conservatives. But what we have witnessed over the past few years is that the reformist branch of the elite is in an existential crisis. So they're basically finding themselves in a similar situation than the ambassador described the situation of the JCPOA. So they're in coma, basically. And this goes back to the failure of the Rouhani administration, who himself, of course, is a centrist, but it was backed by the reformists, to deliver on his campaign promises, as I mentioned earlier. Hence, we've seen over the nationwide protests against the regime, a lot of chants against the reformists. This is a change vis-a-vis the 2009 Green Movement. Which was basically backed by the reformists, and this time around the reformist sections of the elite condemned the street protests because the street protests were against the entire political establishment. So because of that, so there's a long story cut short, because of the immense loss of credibility of the reformist trend, we've seen the historic low voter turnout in last year's parliamentary elections, because people who had voted for the reformists didn't take to the poll, paving the way for a landslide victory of the wider conservative camps. The same is expected with the June presidential elections. Even according to official surveys, 40% of Iranians are not willing to take to the polls because they're disappointed by all factions of the establishment. So this is the situation. Now, in terms of foreign policy, one of the core component of the Iranian strategy is the good cop, bad cop component that is usually deployed against vis-a-vis Western counterparts. That is to argue, if you do not, for example, grant us concessions, domestically, the hardliners will be emboldened. However, this is a misleading, since, as I explained earlier, the Iranian foreign policy, including the nuclear policy, is elite consensus, right? So it was agreed upon by all sections of the elite. So including Rouhani, including Zarif, including even the reformists that are a bit now out of the game, and the Supreme Leader Khamenei. So, so elements of this good cop, bad cop strategy are still, vibrating today in the discourse. Whereas the reality of the matter is that not only is it an elite consensus what the Iranians are doing, and each of their officials playing their role, but geared towards the same end, which is seeing the sanctions that are extremely onerous, not only onto the population, and I'm going to say a little bit about the impact of sanctions in a bit, but also on regime stability. In June, when we have probably a conservative president, it might, even be easier for the West to engage with Iran, because we have basically one camp that is in control of all centers of power. In a nutshell, or to put it, brief, nothing, the June presidential elections are not a very important aspect in the topic that we're discussing today. On the impact of sanctions, they're multifaceted. I've been researching them for much of the past decade. It is true, Phyllis, that the general literature tells us that the aim of sanctions is not often realized, right? Yet, as I argue in my new book, you have to take a case-to-case study. It is true that, first of all, sanctions have enlarged the power gap between civil society and the authoritarian state, okay? This also is a result of the authoritarian regimes externalizing the costs onto the population, right? So this is something that we have to bear in mind. Those are not democratic regimes that, might, spend their money for primarily their own population. But they will spend their money to secure their own interests. So what best serves their own interests. So this is their prime goal. Secondly, when it comes to conflict resolution and foreign policy, as I've explained in my first intervention, Iran resists strong sanctions once they become extreme and crippling during the Obama administration, as well as now as a consequence of Trump's maximum pressure campaign. There is, the cost-benefit analysis starts to change, right? So you don't have to neglect this dynamic. Actually, I explained it in full back then, how Iran all of a sudden was willing to grant major concessions on its nuclear program, as we know from the JCPOA, on all of its components. And now the sanctions are extremely onerous, and the entire establishment wants to see them, removed. And this is why they're, playing this maximum resistance game. They're going to go as far as they can, but they're not going to, pass the threshold of being seen as a de facto nuclear power, because this would not only alienate the West and put the prospect of, would annihilate the prospect of the removal of sanctions by the West, but it would also alienate key Iranian partners such as Russia and China, who are also not interested in a nuclear armed Iran. In other words, the Iranian nuclear strategy is just to increase the leverage as high as they can to get rid of the sanctions. And just very last point, very briefly, because Phyllis, I agree that the responsibility of the American peace movement is primarily towards the US policies. And this pertains to US support to a lot of regimes in the region in terms of military, diplomatic, political, and so forth. Hence, there is also a consequence of US inaction. And I do not agree with your portrayal of the Syria conflict. At the beginning, Of course, the US was supporting regime change entities alongside some Gulf countries, correct? But at the end of the day, not Hillary Clinton's line was victorious, but that of Obama, which was basically pulling back and accepting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which de facto paved the way for the dominance of Russia and Iran, militarily speaking, in Syria, which enabled the genocidal dimensions of the bloodshed in Syria at the hands of Bashar al-Assad. So the Syrian case is quite illuminative for the entire Western peace movement. And I'm not speaking necessarily of you, to be honest, but I see there is a tendency to differentiate between autocracies, be they pro-US or anti-US. So there is a strong tendency to see Tehran, Damascus, and Moscow somehow more of an acceptable actor, and disregarding their policies of human rights violations or quasi-imperialism in some cases, and focus on other regimes. So I think we have to open the picture and be self-critical vis-a-vis those very problematic tendencies that end up de facto strengthening dictatorships.
It's strange. I think we're having a debate between the wrong Iranians and the wrong Americans. But Phyllis, you want to respond? We'll come back to you. But Ali provided a segue for an ad break. So let me just say that Ali's new book is ready for order. It's called Iran in an Emerging New World Order, From Ahmadinejad to Rouhani. Unfortunately, you missed the 40% discount, which was on the day after Valentine's Day. And the book is very expensive, but nevertheless, please check our Facebook page. You'll find an advert for the book there if you are interested. Again, the title is Iran in an Emerging New World Order, From Ahmadinejad to Rouhani, published by Palgrave Macmillan. That's correct, Ali. And second ad is that the Afro-Middle East Center's latest book has also been published. It's this one. It's called Engaging the World, The Making of Hamas's Foreign Policy, authored by Dawood Abdullah, who's the director of Middle East Monitor. And right now you can place an order on the website of Middle East Monitor for that book, Engaging the World, The Making of Hamas's Foreign Policy. We have a comment from Mahdi Qudsi. Mahdi, do you want to jump in? Terry, do you have your hand up? Do you want to speak? Yes. Terry and Kenny after Mahdi. Let's do this, speakers. We'll get Mahdi's comment, Terry and Kenny, and then you can respond to the three of them.
Hello, okay, everyone. Thank you, Naeem, for taking me to talk. Actually, I had just a comment. I actually love the discussion here. I'm pretty much in line. My ideas are in line with Ali because I'm an economist. I'm actually based in Vienna. So what I'm thinking is an optimal solution that has sustainability behind it. So an optimal solution for Iran and the region should be a comprehensive deal. That's the first thing that I wanted to mention here. But of course, the Mr. Ambassador, he is bound by his, role at the embassy, so that he's bound, so he cannot make his own comments on his own. That's why I want to raise a pragmatic solution to what he said about the deal, that everyone in Iran, they believe that the first step should be taken by the US, and US should be fully returned to the JCPOA, and then Iran can go back to its commitments and compliance. But I think, as I wrote in the comment, if someone wants to see and reverse the tape, the first thing that appears after reversal is the last thing that happened. So if we want to get back to the deal, to the full compliance, we can pragmatically think that it is possible to have a stepwise reversal to the deal. So Iran can take one step back, because in 1 week it will be its 6th step that is mandated by the parliament. So step by step, Iran can go back to the deal, and US can also go back to the deal, and it is feasible within 6 months of the Iranian election. So I just wanted to raise this issue, and maybe there could be discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahdi. Let me just say that Ambassador Aghajafari expected to be with us until 6:30. He has another appointment. So Terry, before we come to you, I'm just going to allow the ambassador to respond to anything that he might want to and to say goodbye. Ambassador? Unless his other meeting has started already.
Thank you, Mr. Naeem. I would like to appreciate you and AMEC and other participants in this webinar. I'm sorry I have another program. I have guests. Maybe after 15 minutes, our next program will start in my residence. Now I am at the embassy. So I just want to appreciate for this fruitful webinar. I think the discussion was very positive and very practical, and I hope that everybody use these discussions and this webinar. I just want to appreciate you, and if possible, I leave the webinar, and once again, I appreciate you and other participants.
Thank you, Ambassador, and apologies for keeping you later than we had said we would. Hopefully you'll make it back to your house in time for your meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Terry. We can't hear you, Terry. Terry, you are muted. We can't hear you. Ah, there we go. Okay.
Now?
Yes.
Now. Okay. Thank you. My question is for Phyllis, and it's regarding the US dollar, and the world has been on a Saudi oil standard since 1973, when Kissinger guaranteed the Saudi royal family against domestic insurrection. Now, given recalibration and that the US is no longer dependent on Saudi and Middle East oil, is that Saudi oil standard likely to collapse, and with it the US dollar as the world's reserve currency? And if so, what impact will that have on the US military and financial hegemony in the Middle East, including the impact on Iran-US relationships? And just a little point on the side, interestingly, the Bitcoin price has just hit $50,000, but the gold price is stagnant.
Thank you, Terry. Kenny? Kenny, you are muted.
Okay, fine. I'm muting myself. Good evening, everybody, and thanks to great input from the panel. Quickly, it seems to me that listening to this conversation, one gets the impression that the anomaly in President Barack Obama to negotiate with Iran. And then, but I have the impression that actually the anomaly was, the anomaly was former President Trump. But in true sense, the anomaly was President Barack Obama. If you look at the American geostrategy, and if you look at the foreign policy, listening to all, say, security advisors, be it John Bolton, be it Condoleezza Rice before, or even strategists like Zbigniew Brzezinski and a whole of other people. So if you look at in the long haul, the anomaly, somebody that got out of the norm, was Barack Obama. Now, President Trump just reset. In other words, he normalized from the American foreign policy point of view. You know, I just want to hear your comment on that. I wonder if that makes sense to you.
Thank you, Kenny. If the speakers don't mind, I'm going to take one or two more, and then you can wrap up altogether. Next on the list, we have Diane Perlman. Diane?
Hi, thank you. This is a great, very detailed discussion. I'm learning a lot. I just wanted to make a brief comment that what Mahdi was talking about reversing step by step, that there's actually, that's a strategy. It's known as GRIT, which is Graduated Reciprocated Initiatives in tension reduction that was written about by someone called Charles Osgood in the 80s. It's in different places. It's in a book on psychology and prevention of nuclear war, but it really says, you know, one side takes a unilateral action to reduce tension and then the other side follows. So I just wanted to endorse what Mahdi was saying, that there's actually a strategy that's written about that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. I think ultimately that's probably what we're going to see happening in some or other form. Marian from Istanbul, do you have a question or comment? Marian?
Yes, I do. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I have a question regarding the human rights issue that Mr. Fatullah raised, because as we all know, practical politics have mostly no room for that. I mean, it's hard to make money with human rights, and it's also hard to control people and power, which is what practical politics is about a lot. So my question is, why would or why should any government, be it the US, the European or Iranian government, include human rights in their negotiations? And what motivations could also be brought up and could be raised for them to insist more on human rights, because there have to be incentives that they get something from it. And I'm not asking from a humanitarian point of view, because there the answer is clear. I'm asking from a practical politics point of view.
Thank you, Marian. And for anyone that might be interested, the book that Diane referred to, she's put it in the chat. You can have a look there. Phyllis, Ali, do you want to respond to the comments, questions that have come up in the past couple of minutes?
Sure. Ali, you want to go first?
Ali, go first, then Phyllis can, you know, respond to you as well.
Now.
So I'm gonna respond to Marion's question. Of course, she's right that it's quite a tricky issue, which the issue of human rights has never really appeared prominently in international relations as we know it. Yet, I think there's a practical dimension to it as well, especially from a European standpoint, but also from a US standpoint, perhaps. Just if you look at the Arab Spring of 2011, the revolutions in the Arab world, you see that those revolutions were driven by a dual concern of deep socioeconomic malaise, and secondly, the prevalence of autocracies in that region, that have really worsened the situation. And this is also a de facto result of 4 decades of authoritarian stability policies pursued by the United States and Europe towards the Middle East, in supporting those dictatorships by neoliberal economic policies, but also by military security aspects in terms of cementing their autocracies for the sake of stability. Yet we've seen that this pursuing authoritarian stability is a chimera. It is not sustainable, and sooner than later it's going to collapse. And we've seen it in the ongoing, what my PhD supervisor Gilbert Ashkar calls the ongoing long-term revolutionary process in the region. So in other words, human rights as well as socioeconomic development are intricately linked to questions of political stability. And for that, Europe should be very much cognizant of, because after all, it's its immediate neighborhood. But also, I think this should be an issue of concern for United States policies in the region, because, as I said, it reflects questions of stability or instability in that region. So now, how to go about introducing and tabling the issue of human rights and negotiations between states? I think the only possibility is to introduce conditionalities. To say to the Saudis and to the Iranians and to others, if you do engage in some course corrections in terms of your human rights record, this is gonna have, or if you do not, or if you just continue what you have been doing, this will negatively affect economic deals with you. So to introduce some conditionalities is quite, I think, a way forward to push authoritarian states to accept that they're going to move even a slight bit on the human rights agenda, and without expecting that all of that would radically change their behavior. But I think this is because there would be no incentive without pressure from the side of autocracies to accept how they treat their own citizens. If you can tell them that they're going to destabilize their own country, but I'm not sure, how far autocracies or how much autocracies are very much cognizant of this important factor. So I think it is more worthwhile to do it from governments that are more democratic in trying to, table this important topic.
Thank you, Ali. Phyllis, before you respond, let me just also read out a comment from Ian Drummond, who says, Biden is upholding Trump's legacy, bad in principle from the anti-Trump position that he ran on, and sure to be taken as a vindication of Trump's policies by Trump supporters. Also unlikely to help the moderate candidates in Iran's upcoming presidential election. All round a disastrous position, even from the perspective of Bidenism itself. Phyllis.
Well, just in response to that point, I think we have to be cautious. There is no Biden policy yet. There is a struggle underway within the State Department, within the National Security Council, within the White House, and we don't know how it's going to play out. Biden's only been in office 4 weeks, just under 4 weeks. And as we know, foreign policy is not, and it's not going to be for the next 6 months or more, his main agenda. It simply isn't. The rest of the world will say it should be, and I would tend to agree with that. But I'm not calling the shots in the White House. His main agenda is dealing with the pandemic and dealing with the economic crisis within the United States. And until there's a moment of crisis, which would be a very bad thing to happen, I'm afraid that foreign policy is going to be kicked down the road for quite a while. So I would just caution all of us to not be assessing what the impact is going to be of the Biden policy, because we don't know yet what it is, how much it will look like Obama's policy, how much it will look like Trump's policy. Right now, it looks a lot like Trump's policy because nothing has changed yet. That doesn't make it necessarily the policy that will win out. I think that the points that Ali is making about human rights, I agree with all of it. But I think we have to come back to who's doing the negotiating. If I were negotiating, if Ali was negotiating, if Naeem was negotiating, and if we were negotiating on behalf of civil society in our own countries and globally, we would be demanding very different things from governments than one government has the legitimacy to demand of another, particularly a government like the United States, who I would argue, whose policies have enabled not only authoritarianism on the rise in the last 4 years under Trump, which has been very extreme, but throughout the post-World War II period, somewhat before that, but certainly in that period, it has enabled the worst human rights violators on the grounds of stability, on the grounds of markets, on the grounds of neoliberalism, on the grounds especially of anti-communism. If we look at the slaughter of people in Indonesia in 1965, what made that possible? US not only support, but US assistance. That is the reality of who is sitting across the table from other human rights violators within their own countries. The US is really it is a superpower on the question of human rights violations. It's the one country that can really claim that in every continent and many, many, many countries, it has enabled or assisted in massive human rights violations. So the notion that it should be taken seriously in holding up human rights as a demand within these kinds of negotiations, I think is simply not a realistic one, to use the IR term. I do think that there is a significant danger in allowing this to go on for too long. I have a somewhat different view. I think that there's no question Ali knows much more than I do about the internal dynamics within Iran, but from looking at it from outside, I think it's a mistake to say that the elite consensus is all-encompassing and that the timing imposed by the elections don't matter. I think they do matter. I think it is important for us in the United States to be constantly reminding the public of the danger of what happens if there's not quick, or at least quicker action on this issue. It's going to be a struggle, but I think we have to fight for that. The danger of increasing or continuing these US-Iran tensions are not only looking at what's been ratcheted up in terms of sanctions over the last 4 years, where Iran, the ambassador was right about one thing, that Iran has acted as the adults in the room and have not taken the bait of US efforts to force them to respond more dramatically in a military sense. But there is a huge impact going on in Syria, in Yemen, in Palestine, across the region. And there is also, we should not forget, the threat of a real shooting war between US and Iranian forces that could happen in the Persian Gulf. Not even, even if both sides, with all of their various factions, are agreed they don't want a shooting war, which I tend to think is the case, both in Tehran and in Washington, except for some in Washington who thankfully are not in power at the moment, who do want a shooting war, but they're a minority and they're not in power. Those who are in power, I think, agree in both capitals they don't want a shooting war. That doesn't mean it won't happen, because when you have a highly militarized environment like what's going on right now in the Persian Gulf, elsewhere as well, but in this case, you have a situation where there is very little direct communication, the way the US had direct communication with Russia in Syria, where it was prepared to be fine with massive Syrian casualties, military as well as civilians. They were not prepared to levy casualties against Russia. So they had a military to military hotline that could stave off any potential problem. That doesn't exist between the US and Iran when it comes to what could happen in the Persian Gulf, where you have US warships, US aircraft carriers, carrier groups, destroyers, and you have a very quick and efficient Iranian naval force that's able to maneuver throughout that area. If a young sailor on either side sees late one night on duty on the deck, sees a flare and thinks they're under attack and responds, there will be little capacity for it to be called back on the grounds that it was a mistake and was not an act of war. So it's a very dangerous moment. This issue of the JCPOA is not simply a matter of ending sanctions against Iran. That's the fundamental driving force. But the consequences of maintaining this level of active hostility between the two countries is a very, very dangerous one that could result not only in a war there, but a war that could become regional and unfortunately could go global. There's a bunch of other questions. Terry's question about the US dollar, I'm no expert on the dollar, but I do know that the US financial system in terms of banking and financialization, I think right now it has been far more important for some years now than the agreement with Saudi Arabia around the role of the dollar in the oil industry. Let's see, on Mahdi's pragmatic solution, which I appreciated Diane's clarification on where that is in the academic work on conflict resolution. I think this is exactly how diplomacy is going to move forward. There's always the challenge of who makes the first step, who blinks first. It's never a blink that is everything, that we give up everything first and then and then expect you to give up everything. It's making that first step. I anticipate, ironically enough, that Iran is going to make the first step because it's in their self-interest to do so. That could not be the case. I don't have a fly on the wall in any of those meetings in either capital, but I think this is how it's going to go forward. It's the one reason why I'm a little bit more positive than I was 2 weeks ago, seeing that the key US negotiator is somebody who has spent the last almost 10 years working for the International Crisis Group, has a very sophisticated understanding of what diplomacy requires, and that's Rob Malley. So I'm hopeful that real diplomacy is something that is going to come out of this process more rapidly than I think, not as rapidly as I hope, but before any further damage gets done.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. Let me just read out one more comment and then we will close. This is from Hana Atiyah. While I also agree with Dr. Fathullah Nejad's human rights related comments, I also think that this will make a new deal very difficult. it is important to remember that what made the JCPOA possible, among other things, was a clear separation of nuclear goals and non-nuclear or other goals, whereas the US prioritized the former. Okay, thank you to our three speakers, Phyllis, Ali, and the ambassador who's not here, but there are others from the embassy who are here. We'll convey our thanks to him. Also to Zinat, who, due to circumstances beyond any of our control, was unable to join us. And to all of those who participated, apologies for those of you who would have preferred to watch this on Facebook, but then had to scramble to get on to Zoom because the link wasn't working. We